All right, thank you. All right, it's a pleasure to have here Dr. Lazebnik from University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She's from the Computer Science Department. Prior to joining the Computer Science Department, where she's currently assistant professor, she was at University of Urbana, Illinois, at Urbana-Champaign, where she did her master's and PhD under Jean Pons jointly with Dr. Schmidt at INRIA, and she held a postdoctoral position at University of Illinois, and her research interests are in computer vision and object recognition and machine learning. And today she'll be sharing with us some of her recent research in object recognition. And it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yeah. So most of the work I'm going to talk about was basically done by me in Champaign, since I've only been here in North Carolina for less than 2 months. So I will talk about my research on building models for object and scene recognition, but first let me just briefly motivate why do we need vision and recognition technologies going forward. And one of the biggest driving forces is just digital imaging, the revolution in digital imaging. Now that everybody has a digital camera, maybe even in their cell phone, everybody's taking pictures, everybody has huge personal photo albums that are just cluttering up space on hard drives that are very hard to organize, sort through, and search. On a collective level, this phenomenon is just enormous. Popular photo sharing sites like Flickr have many hundreds of millions photos, and these numbers I have, as you can see, are pretty old. These days, Google and Yahoo don't even publish the size of their image search indices, so it's hard to say how many images are on the web. But it's definitely in the billions, and it's growing exponentially. We not only have still images, we have lots of video from movies, amateur video clips, and so on. So if you just look at official movie titles and TV series, there's about 1 million titles. But on YouTube, all the amateur movie clips that people like to upload and share, there are tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions by now. Then, of course, there's a lot of applications in areas like surveillance and security, scientific, medical imaging. So the bottom line is we can take a digital image of just about anything, from a tiny molecule to a huge faraway galaxy. We can map the entire world with satellite imagery. But what are we going to do with this sheer volume of pixels? Right now, we don't really have the technologies to actually mine these things for useful information. And this problem is not just in the numbers, not just in the sheer size of the data, it's also from a fundamental research perspective a very complex problem. And the question is, how do we go about building models or representations from pulling useful semantic information out of the confusing low-level massive pixels? And I put up these images from National Geographic up here because to me they do a very good job of illustrating the richness and the complexity of the world and all the visual phenomena in it. If you think of all the different shapes, the variability of shape, texture, material, lighting, complex atmospheric phenomena like haze, etc. How do we build models to account for this variability? And one thing that I find useful is actually to draw an analogy between images and language. So just to make it more concrete, here are actually some paragraphs from captions to some of these pictures, to juxtapose the raw visual data with language describing the pictures. And at first glance, if you look at these paragraphs, the language seems to be just as confusing and complex as the pictures themselves. The language is also incredibly rich and varied and expressive, and yet from our viewpoint in computer vision, language actually has a lot of nice properties that pictures don't have. First of all, there is a very natural, concrete notion of a finite alphabet and of a finite vocabulary. There's a linear order between words. None of these things we have in images. We don't have a natural notion of an alphabet or a vocabulary or a grammar. Images are 2D instead of 3D. Images are built essentially out of more or less continuous data as opposed to just discrete symbols. So what we want to do in order to get more of a grip on representing images is to try to force images to be more like language. So we want to somehow pull out letters and words, nice discrete structures out of images that then we can build statistical models on top of. So one of the models that we can take from language that's also useful for images is a bag of words model. So it's a very simple and classical model for presenting a document. Basically, you throw away all the information about the order of the words in the document, and you just look at the frequencies of the words. So it's essentially what's known today as a tag cloud. And just to make it more concrete, here is basically the tag cloud or the bag of words for President Bush's most recent State of the Union address. And the size of all the words tells you how frequent they were. So right away, just by looking at this bag of words, you can immediately see what the speech was about. It was all about Iraq and terrorists.
That's not fair. Bush's vocabulary is very limited.
Yeah, but actually this website, it has State of the Union speeches and actually important presidential speeches going way back. So here is President Kennedy, who maybe he had a richer vocabulary, and you can see in 1962 what his speech was all about. It was all about Soviet nuclear weapons, and Cuba was pretty important, and so on. Or President Roosevelt in request for a declaration of war, you can see what was important right there. So this just says that if you want to find out about the main topics in a document, it's often sufficient just to look at this bag of words and at frequencies of words in a document. So we can try to do something similar for images. We can have a bag of features model for an image. So what we do is instead of visual words, we just sample image patches in some way. We can use some key point detector to extract salient patches or just sample small image patches more or less randomly. And then basically we discard all the information about the spatial relationships of patches in the image and where they were in an image and just look at the distribution of patch appearance. So here you can see that in this bag of features we have some patches that look like eyes, noses, pieces of a mouth, pieces of plants, some kind of architectural elements. So based on this, we can make a pretty good guess that there was probably a face somewhere in the image, there were some plants or flowers, there was a building. We may not be able to go back and say exactly where all of these things were, but just by looking at a bag of features, we can make fairly accurate predictions about what classes were present in the image, or to tag this image with relevant topics. So this is the kind of scenario that my talk is mostly focused on, basically learning to predict global content labels for the entire image, as opposed to trying to segment the image or localize things in images. So this is mainly tagging, is what we're after. So in a bit more detail, this is how bag of features models work. So we start with some database of images that we want to represent, and we extract patches either by using a key point detector or uniform sampling of patches or random sampling of patches. And then we quantize each patch to some sort of code book or visual vocabulary. This is just to make things more computationally convenient, so that instead of dealing with the high-dimensional vector of pixels that describes each patch, we just deal with its quantizer label. So then our bag of features in the end is just a histogram of frequency counts over this visual codebook. And then we can take these histograms and, for example, learn classifiers or do retrieval and so on. Okay, so I've done a lot of work on these kinds of models earlier on in my PhD. So one of the first models I developed was for recognition of textured surfaces, and it was using complementary key point detectors. So you can see that there's a Laplacian blob detector that for this image picks out the dark windows and the light spaces between the windows. And then there's a Harris corner detector, which basically picks out the corners as you would expect. But these two detectors give you complementary kinds of image structures, which gives a richer description. And moreover, you can see that the shapes of these patches are actually adapted to the local image structure. So this adaptation helps you to factor out transformations such as scalings, rotations, change in surface orientation, anything that we can locally approximate by an affine model. So this gives us a lot of geometric invariance. Later on, we've developed these models further, not just to recognize textures, but also to deal with fairly complex object databases like this one. So this is an international visual object classes challenge. So right now it's already in its third year. I think this was the first year. And this is data pulled from the web. So you can see that the objects of interest actually can appear against pretty complex and cluttered backgrounds. There can be multiple objects of interest and so on. And the task here is basically just to say whether or not the image contains an object of interest. For example, does the image contain a motorbike or not? And in this kind of classification task, our model was actually one of the first. I think, in fact, it was the first that won all the categories. Okay, but in this talk, I will talk about some of my more recent research that's really trying to deal with the more tricky aspects of bag of features models. First of all, we really want to look at this issue of what makes a good visual codebook or vocabulary. Since there is no default or standard visual code book, how do we learn a good one? And the second part of the talk will talk about introducing spatial relations into a bag of features. Sometimes you simply lose too much information when you throw away all the spatial relations. So we want to put some back without really sacrificing the simplicity of a bag of features, but we still want to gain some discriminative power. Okay, so let me first then talk about the problem of building visual codebooks. And since I'm really interested in the classification setting or in the problem of ultimately being able to predict some image tags or class labels, I want a codebook that's good for predicting these class labels. So this is the basic problem. We start out with a number of image features, let's say, derived from local image patches, and they also come with labels of the images that they originate from. And in order, for new images, in order to predict the class, we want to be able to quantize these feature vectors such that the code word index of a given feature vector has as much predictive power about the class as the original feature. So we want to be able to quantize these feature vectors using some nearest neighbor codebook without losing any predictive power. So this sounds like an information theoretic thing. And in fact, we formalize it by saying that in order to be predictive, this code word index k should approximate as much as possible a sufficient statistic of x, the feature, for y, the class label. So ideally, it would be, in fact, a sufficient statistic, so we lose nothing in going from x to k. But in practice, of course, it's not possible because we're doing data compression, so some information will be lost. And we want to minimize the loss of this discriminative information. Okay, so then what happens is when you represent some continuous feature vector x by a discrete label k, its own probability distribution of class labels gets replaced by a different distribution over class labels associated with a quantizer index k. And in the next few slides, I will abbreviate the class distribution of the ith feature to p sub I, and the class distribution of the kth quantizer index to pi sub k. So when you just look at the problem of minimizing information loss, finding a codebook of these pi sub k's to minimize information loss, this turns out to be the objective function, and it has appeared before in the literature. It's simply the sum of KL divergences between the class distributions associated with the individual labels and the class distributions of the indices they get quantized to. So this is how you can visualize it. This is the probability simplex of class labels. And to optimize this, we have an algorithm very similar to k-means. So each p sub I gets assigned to the nearest pi sub k, where nearness is measured by KL divergence. And then we can update the pi sub k simply by averaging the p sub i's that get assigned to it, and you iterate. So it's just like k-means, only with KL divergence. And it only works on probability distributions. So this turns out to be not good enough for us, because we don't just have the probability distributions, we also have these feature vectors in space somewhere. So we want to do quantization in the feature space, which is a vector space, as opposed to quantization just in the probability simplex. So this is then how we modify the approach. We want to simultaneously quantize the feature space with a codebook in the feature space and the probability simplex with a codebook in the probability simplex. So then we specify that the data has to be encoded by nearest neighbor rule in the feature space. So this then is the feature space where these image patches live in. So given a new image patch, x sub I, we quantize it to the nearest codebook entry in this codebook in the feature space. But then we measure the error of this quantization in the probability simplex by comparing the respective class distributions. So the encoding takes place in the feature space, but this objective function is measured in the probability space. And the learning problem then is to position these m sub k's in the feature space to minimize the error in the probability space. So then you can see that the objective function depends really on both codebooks, on codebook M in the feature space and codebook pi in the probability space. However, there's still a problem with this objective function, namely that it's defined over hard partitions. So it's extremely hard to optimize. So what we have to do to make it more tractable computationally is to go from hard partitions to soft partitions. So we want to make the objective function differentiable. So we introduce some soft cluster assignment weights. So each point x gets assigned to each codebook vector k with some probability, or not probability, it's rather a weight. They don't really have a probabilistic interpretation because we're not really doing generative modeling. So we put these weights into the objective function, and all of a sudden it becomes differentiable. And then we simply find local minima of this function by alternating minimization, since it depends on two sets of parameters. So in each iteration, we first fix the codebook in the probability space and update the codebook in the feature space by gradient descent. And then vice versa, we fix the codebook in the feature space, and then the updates for pi actually have a very simple closed form. You just do weighted averaging of the p sub i's in each cluster. So let me give you an example of what this actually does. So here's a synthetic data set with two classes, where one class, the red class, is in a circle in the middle, and then the second blue class is in a ring around it. And both, overall the data is uniformly distributed, so if you just run k-means, k-means really doesn't look at the labels, so it tells you nothing about the boundary between the classes. But then when we initialize this information loss minimization with the output of the k-means, this is what happens. The centers really migrate to find the decision regions between the two classes. And you can also see the comparison of classification rate. So k-means is down here, and the information loss codebook is up here. And similarly, the information loss codebook preserves more mutual information between the class label and the cluster center, which obviously is not surprising because that's explicitly what we're maximizing. So here's another example which is slightly more complicated. Now the classes overlap with each other, so there's no perfect separation, and they're not uniformly distributed. So this is k-means. You can see that boundaries pass in the high density regions of the classes, but the information loss clustering actually does a better job of finding decent decision boundaries. And here are more results on real image patches from different kinds of data sets: textured images, satellite images, handwritten digits. And the features that are used to represent the patches are different in each case. So they range from 36-dimensional to 256-dimensional. But in every case, you see the same behavior, that this information loss codebook behaves better than the k-means codebook. And
features, for instance, in the
so here it's actually not important. We just pull them out of like a standard. So for the characters, it's actually the raw image patch,
raw image,
like 16 by 16 or something like that. And here's some kind of averages of texture features or whatever. Here it's not important because we just get them from a standard machine learning repository. And the reason we're always comparing to k-means is because k-means right now is pretty much the default method for building visual code books, even in state-of-the-art learning systems. We don't really know many methods that are better than k-means. Okay, so here then is actually the application that I was aiming for in the very beginning, is bag of features image classification. So this is the test bed for this task. It's a fairly challenging data set. It has 15 scene categories. You can see that they range from indoor, like office, kitchen, living room, bedroom, to outdoor, such as coast, mountain, forest. And then there are some fairly tricky categories, like industrial and store. So they have a lot of variability. And for testing, it's a 15-way classification task. So given a new test image, we have to assign to it one of these 15 labels. And there are several hundred images per category. So we use 100 images per category to train. And you know, in the past, these are the kinds of recognition rates that people have gotten for this task. That was, this is about circa 2005 or so. So for feature extraction, what we do here is we sample fixed size patches, 16 by 16 patches on a regular grid. And to get a feature vector for each patch, we compute a so-called SIFT descriptor. So SIFT descriptors right now are very popular in computer vision. It's one of sort of the best descriptors we know for representing local image appearance. And the way it's computed, we have our patch. So the patch gets subdivided into this 4x4 grid. And inside of each grid cell, we compute a histogram of gradient orientations. So the dimensionality then of the descriptor is 16 grid cells times 8 orientations in the histogram, which gives you a 128 dimensional feature vector. And these are the vectors that we're actually quantizing. So these are the classification results. And finally, so after we've quantized the patches and built the histograms, to get a classifier, we need to learn some model over the histograms. So here you can see we've learned a naive Bayes model, which is relatively weak, and also a support vector machine, which works better. But you can see that in every case, the information loss minimization codebook does better than the k-means codebook. The difference is maybe of a couple of %, and it's more significant for smaller codebook sizes. And you can also see standard deviations over multiple random training test splits. So these differences are pretty stable. And you can also see the difference visually between the two types of codebooks. So the k-means codebook looks something like this for 32 centers. You can see that the centers are kind of washed out patches without much texture, which is what you would expect when you average a lot of image patches together. But the information loss codebook has much more interesting centers, has stronger textures, more contrast, and so on. So intuitively, it kind of looks like it would be a more discriminative codebook. Okay, and now let me show you another application for this framework, which is completely different from image classification, but in fact uses exactly the same objective function, just with a slightly different interpretation. So we want to use this objective function for image segmentation. So now we want to compute a Voronoi partitioning of an image by putting C centers in the image. And each of these Voronoi regions associated with each of the centers has some sort of average appearance distribution. And we want basically this partitioning to be such that the appearance at each pixel is as similar as possible to the appearance of the region that it gets assigned to. And it turns out actually that this kind of criterion makes a lot of sense for image segmentation. Very similar looking objective functions have been proposed for level set image segmentation, where they are trying to partition an image into only 2 regions, and they're doing it with a smooth curve instead of, in our case, we're doing a Voronoi partition by putting multiple centers. So, you know, the details of the optimization are completely the same, but the idea behind the objective function is actually very similar. So here's an example of how this works. When we start with a regular grid, and this is basically how the minimization evolves for a few iterations. So you can see that the centers basically shift in such a way as to produce regions that are as uniform as possible. And here are some more examples for a few more images. So obviously this is not state-of-the-art image segmentation, but it's pretty clear what this objective function is trying to do here. So let me just summarize this part of my talk. The key idea here is quantization, and we need quantization to be able to build models of complicated high-dimensional data such as images. Things just become a lot more tractable when we boil down all those high-dimensional feature vectors into discrete indices. Because then when we can, for example, draw on the kinds of statistical models that are very successful in text processing, such as bags of words. So it really pays off when we can quantize visual data properly. So the nice thing about an information theoretic formulation of quantization is that we get discriminative results by information loss minimization. We capture the notion of discriminability, but we're not tied to any particular classifier. So we don't have any classifier loss functions or anything like that in our optimization, but the representation we produce in principle should be good for any classifier. And the application of visual codebook construction at first looks like it doesn't have a lot in common with image segmentation, but we can handle both using the same principle. Okay, so then let me move on to the second part of the talk about spatial relations. So, of course, we're still unhappy with bag of features models because they don't capture any spatial information. And, in computer vision, we have tried a lot to capture spatial relations. This is basically the bread and butter of computer vision, building parts and relations models representing shape, and so on and so forth. And I've done some of this work myself, and a lot of times it's just a huge pain. So when you build a parts and relations model for an object category, it starts looking like some sort of graphical model, which means that learning it is a big pain, it's computationally intractable, etc., etc. And the bottom line is they don't always work well for simple tasks like image tagging. So then my observation was that, well, we don't necessarily have to torture ourselves with graphical models if all we want is global image tagging. All we want to do is capture some kind of global spatial relations that may still be helpful, that may still be very important for the classification task. So what we want to do is to go from an orderless model, which is a bag of features, to a locally orderless model, which somehow coarsely captures spatial information. So to illustrate this idea, here's an image of a beach. And to make it locally orderless, we just scramble pixels in some small radius. We displace each pixel not very far from its original location. And this is what happens. So you can see that now in this image you can no longer make out any of the objects. You can't make out the people or the beach umbrellas or the chairs. And yet, this image still looks pretty recognizably like a beach. You have some sky here, you have something that looks like water and sand. So just by looking at this locally orderless representation where you're not precisely sure about the location of the features, you can still do recognition pretty well. So this is what we want to achieve. So what we want to do is start basically with a bag of features where you could think of it as scrambling the features over the entire image, so it's totally orderless. We gradually reduce the scrambling radius. So at level 1, we only scramble locally in each image quadrant. So in practice, it means we just compute a feature histogram for each of the 4 quadrants. And then we keep going like this, gradually reducing our scrambling radius. So this is a representation that I call a spatial pyramid, and it's just a concatenation of all these histograms. So then the question is, how do we match these hierarchical histograms? So to figure out a good way to match them, we can just think of the simplest possible image matching problem, where we have 2 images with some features in them. In this case, the features are just edge pixels, and we want to find a matching between them, so that matching points, if you put the 2 images on top of each other, are just as close as possible. So usually, to do it exactly, it would be a bipartite matching problem. But the key insight is that we don't want to do it exactly. We don't care exactly where the pixels are because we've scrambled them. So what we can do instead is we can put these coarse grids over the image and just count the number of pixels in each grid cell. And then we just say that any pixel or any feature point from one image matches any point in another image as long as it's in the same or in the corresponding grid cell. So then we can easily count the number of matches just by doing histogram intersection over these grids. But then at the next level, we want to coarsen the grids to be able to match features that maybe fell across a boundary, or were still reasonably close together but not close enough to be in the same grid cell. So we merge grid cells at the next level and do this matching again until finally we get to level 0, where any feature in one image matches any feature in another image. So it's back to totally orderless matching. And then we just count the total matching weight. Basically, the lower we go in the pyramid, the lower we weight the matches, because now they can be between points that are farther and farther away from each other. And we also have to, from the number of matches at each level, we have to subtract the number of matches at the previous level, because the coarser level already includes the finer level. So this is how we get the matching score. And this kind of scheme has actually been proposed by Grauman and Darrell to match high-dimensional point sets or high-dimensional feature clouds. So they actually proposed doing this uniform quantization in high dimensions and computing these things over high-dimensional grids. But it doesn't work all that well over high-dimensional uniform grids because the approximation quality really degrades. However, over 2 dimensions, it works just fine. So this basically gives us a kernel that we can put in a support vector machine to do the classification. And as far as the feature space goes, once again, we handle it by quantizing it, so that in effect we do this pyramid match separately for each quantization index. So we make the approximation that only the features with the same quantizer index can match one another. So I will show you results of this for 2 different types of features. Weak features, which are basically just oriented edge points at computed at 2 different scales and 8 different orientations. So this gives us a very simple vocabulary of size 16. And then strong features are SIFT descriptors on a regular grid, just like I showed you before. So the idea is we want to see how much improvement we can get out of each of these just by putting the spatial grid on top of them. So for the same scene category data set from the first part of the talk, basically this is what we get. So with weak features, orderless matching or bag of features matching gives us 45%, but the pyramid gives us 66%. So it's an improvement of 20%. And for the strong features, we start with 72% with bags of features, and we are able to go up to about 81%, so almost 10% improvement from the spatial pyramid. So you can see that these are pretty encouraging results. And what else is interesting, so you may notice that actually, so this column, the left column, just shows you the results for matching only the single highest level of the pyramid. And the right column shows you what you get from matching the highest level plus all the lower levels combined. So you can see that the difference is maybe a couple of %, but what happens with the highest level, once you start subdividing finely enough, the performance of the highest level drops because it's already over quantized. But when you put all the lower levels back into the matching, this drop basically is ameliorated. So you really recover from this quantization effect at the highest level. And these are also the confusions that we get just to show which categories are hard to distinguish. So basically we get the main confusions are in the indoor scene categories like living room, bedroom, kitchen, which is really not surprising at all, because these things can be, even for a human, sometimes hard to classify. Like, for example, this image on the left, which is a kitchen, you know, you have to look sort of carefully to figure out, is this a kitchen or is this a dining room? You have to be able to tell that this is a refrigerator, you know, this is an oven, and so on. Whereas this image here of a living room might at first look like a kitchen because it's kind of rustic, but then you really have to see, do you see any kitchen appliances anywhere? Is this a refrigerator or is this a TV? You know, so if this was an oven or something like that instead of a TV, you would have said this was a kitchen. Or this bedroom might look like a living room if you squint, but you actually have to figure out that this is a bed in order to classify it correctly. So you really have to do some higher order semantic reasoning in order to do better here. And obviously this is not something that our method even begins to capture. So a few more results for the for the spatial pyramid matching. This right now, this Caltech 101 dataset, it has 100 object categories. It's one of the most popular benchmarks in the recognition community right now. We are able to get 64%, so that's an improvement of over 20% from a bag of features. And actually, a year ago, it was one of the highest performing methods on this data set. So you can see that our results were second from the top with 30 images per class. So this is a 100-way classification, so chance performance would be 1%. And this, you know, this plot is about a year old, and more recently, I think the highest results are 77% that were recently reported from a group in Oxford. And guess what the title of their paper is? Representing shape with a spatial pyramid kernel. So they actually drew on a lot of my ideas to get a new method that is already like up here. And now, you know, once again, just to give you an idea of the benchmarking efforts in the community, the Caltech group has actually introduced the Caltech 256 database. So, you know, we want to test on ever more object categories. And they've implemented our method on Caltech 256 to serve as a baseline, because one of the other things I didn't mention is that all these published methods for Caltech 101, for the most part, are extremely difficult to re-implement if you look at them. And ours is probably by far the simplest, which is really another advantage. And it also worked very well on last year's PASCAL challenge. So it won many of the categories. So to summarize this, you know, this method really is very, very simple. I'm not going to say that it's complicated or that it captures any subtle spatial relations. It captures things that are very, very simple. It basically captures things like, if you take a picture of a landscape, the sky is usually going to be on top, the horizon is going to be somewhere toward the middle of the picture, and on the bottom you're going to probably see grass or earth or something like that. So really it captures very simple facts like that, but it's very, very powerful. Even on PASCAL dataset, where there's a lot of variability in the backgrounds, and there's still, you know, some global spatial irregularities that are hard to avoid. You know, so this, you know, I think in the future is not necessarily going to be the solution to object recognition, because it's just a simple global method, but it's useful for many things. For example, it can capture scene context. You can say something about the general identity of the scene let's say, are you looking at a highway versus a classroom? If you're looking at the highway, then you might want to go and detect some cars. But if you're looking at a classroom, then maybe you want to detect some computer screens, some textbooks, etc. And for benchmarks, it's also extremely important to have good, strong baselines for new methods to be able to compare to them. So to conclude, let me just say a few more things about my research interests for the future. So the most fundamental research interest is just understanding basic building blocks of images. That's more or less what my talk was all about. You know, the basic building block of all these models is a local image patch. So we want to understand, for example, how can we quantize these image patches effectively to build stronger models. Next, I'm interested in, essentially you can think of it as building a visual language for image description. So this is really going back to the whole images and language parallel. So local patches or local features that I've talked about, you could think of them as visual words or visual nouns. So each patch tells you something very simple and declarative, such as this is an eye, or this is a piece of wood, or something like that. So next, we want to group these simple visual words into maybe something like phrases. So you could think of the spatial groupings of features in the second part of my talk as an attempt to form a phrase or a group that somehow tells you more than each individual feature. But speculatively, we can really go a lot farther with this. We can try to have visual adjectives to describe appearance and style of things. For action recognition, we can have verbs and so on and so forth. So this is more or less a metaphor, but this is something we really need in order to have really good, strong visual models and recognition algorithms. Next, all I've talked about today was basically just pure 2D vision, no 3D at all. So, you could think of this as an output that a 2D recognition algorithm would give you, and not even my algorithms that I've shown you today, because these would only give you global image labels. But we can use other 2D algorithms, for example, to segment the scene or to detect objects of interest like buildings, people, cars, so you can get a 2D bounding box. But it gives you some semantic information. And then there's also 3D vision. I didn't talk about it, but it was another big strand of my past research, and also the computer science department at UNC right now is very strong in 3D vision. We have a very big 3D vision group. So they can drive a car down the street and basically tell you 3D information. They can do stereo to tell you depth maps, orientations of surfaces. They can reconstruct the street for you. So ultimately what we want to do is put together the 2D semantic understanding with 3D geometry to get comprehensive 3D scene understanding. So you would not only know that this bounding box in the image probably has a car in it, you would know exactly where this car is in 3D, and maybe if it's moving, which way is it going, and so on and so forth. So you can really start reasoning about objects in 3D. And not only geometrically, but also semantically. And I think this is one of the very important directions to go in right now in computer vision. And finally, going even further, beyond 3D, images that just don't exist in isolation out there. They come with camera metadata, GPS data. If you've downloaded an image from the web, it either has a caption or it has a list of tags associated with it, or it comes from a web page that has some text on it. If you watch a movie, you can get a closed captioning transcript or a movie script corresponding to it. You can get the audio track. So we really need to build integrated models of all these different modalities together. So this is my vision for the future, if you will, and this is my webpage where you can get more details about all of these things. So that's all. Do you have questions?
Any questions?
You mentioned about spatial relationship, like the sky is on the top and the beach at the bottom. So if you have an inverted image, does it work equally well?
Yeah, so then it is not working anymore. So this representation would not be invariant to simple things like flipping or rotation and so on. And that's even not the goal here. So I've worked on other things that have, that were concerned a lot about invariance, but here the philosophy is basically the opposite. Let's just throw invariance out the window and look at how people really tend to take pictures. You don't find very many pictures on the web where the sky is on the bottom and the grass is on top. It could theoretically happen, but it just doesn't. So we're just looking basically at very simple statistics of the way that people really do take pictures and capitalizing on that.
Let me actually ask the NCAT, do you have any questions?
I hope we didn't lose them.
No, they're up there.
Ah, there they are.
All right, okay. If not, are there any more questions here? No?
Okay.
So you mentioned something about the scene reconstruction. So what are you doing exactly there in terms of? So are you still operating on a sort of a modular basis?
So it depends. What do you mean by modular basis?
Via these patches that.
So actually we can, and some of the work that I've been involved in before, let me try to find it. Some of the work I've done before actually is along these lines. It's also based on patches, but it does multi-view reconstruction. So the idea is when you extract a fine invariant patches from an image, they're shaped like a parallelogram. So you get, in fact, a point on two axes, or you could think of it as 3 points. So that actually you can match up these affine invariant points across images to get patches in 3D that already have an orientation. So it comes from the fact that each patch essentially has 3 points in it, has 3 points, or it has a location and an orientation. So you get this model, which is a collection of 3D patches, and each patch basically estimates the surface orientation there. So you could call that modular because it's still patch-based, but now it starts with detecting patches in each image, but then it matches them across images and does structure from motion to estimate where these patches are in 3D. And then we can, once we've built this model from multiple viewpoints, and another nice thing about it is that we don't have to know these camera positions a priori. So they don't even have to be calibrated. Just from the patch matching tracks, we can extract both the 3D positions and the camera information. So this is kind of the flavor of some of the 3D work.
But the patches do carry some sort of localization information with them, right?
Right, yeah. So here you do care where they are because you have to do the structure from motion, so you actually you use the 2D positions and the shapes of the patches to solve for the 3D positions.
Any other questions? Well, if not, let's thank our speaker again.